Today we turn cedar fence pickets into soap dishes for Christmas gifts. So the first thing we're going to do is cut these boards down to rough length. I like to cut them to lengths so that I can get 4 soap dishes out of each board. So since I want them to be 4 inches long about, I'm going to cut all of these down to 17 inches. One upgrade that I'm glad I made to my miter saw was to purchase these flip-up stop blocks that attach to the wings of the miter saw. I don't have a nice miter station with a fence with a built-in stop block, so these make it a lot easier to set up repeatable cuts with the saw. For this project, jointing the boards isn't strictly necessary. Sanding them is just fine. However, if you do joint and plate them and properly mill them down, all of the subsequent steps will just be a little bit easier. And it doesn't really take all that much time. I only have this little 4-inch baby jointer, which is great for this size board. A quick pass through the planer, and we'll be ready to head back over to the table saw. Apparently, my last table saw project was cutting some sort of angle because I have to set this back to 90. I never trust the gauge that comes built into the table saw, so I always double check everything with this angle gauge.
90-degree perfection.
Next up is to cut the grooves to allow the soap dish to drain. Set your blade height to about 1/3 of the thickness of the board. The exact measurement doesn't super matter, but you want to make sure that you don't go too far through so that the board has a risk of cracking. Then work on finding the center line of your board. In my case, this board is 3 1/4 inches wide, so the center line will be at the 1 5/8 inch mark. One trick to finding the exact center is to measure from both sides. So in my case, I measured 1 5/8 from each side, and those two lines are a little bit off from each other. Directly in between those two measurements will be the exact center of your board. Now set your table saw fence so that you can cut a groove directly down that center line of the board. And then go to town. Next, it's time to cut the remaining grooves in the soap dishes. I found that setting the first set of grooves a 1/2 inch from the edge of the fence worked well, and then the next set of grooves 1 inch away from the edge of the fence. With the thickness of the blade, this set the grooves to about 3/8 of an inch apart. So this is what it should look like approximately when you're done, whatever your spacings wound up being. They're not 100% perfect. I suspect that my center line is a 32nd of an inch off. But unless you're looking with calipers or are a designer like my wife is, you probably wouldn't notice the difference in where the grooves are lined up. At this point, we could call it essentially done, go in, sand all the pieces, cut them up into chunks, put a little bit of finish on them, and call it a day. There's one more step that I like to do to a lot of my projects just to make them a little bit fancier, look a little bit nicer. And that's going to be to add a chamfer to the bottom edge so that you get a little bit of a profile, a little bit of an upgrade to the look. It's certainly not necessary, but it's something that I do to most of my projects, especially boards like this. I do it to all my cutting boards and everything like that. I must pretty much know what I'm doing because that is my first cut, and that pretty much looks exactly like I want it to.
And then, like anything else in woodworking, we sand. Cedar is a very soft wood to work with, which has some benefits and drawbacks. The benefit is that it's very, very easy to sand. It goes quick and it's easy to get those gouges and grooves and saw marks and all that out of it. The less good part is that it is also very, very easy to over sand and kind of ruin your profiles. So what I'm doing here is just starting with 180 grit. That way I know that I won't over sand anything. And when I'm doing the edges, I'm making sure to not press down hardly at all. I trim these down to size using my crosscut sled and the table saw. I could have easily used the miter saw, but I like using my crosscut sled. I set up a stop block with a clamp and started feeding all the boards through. I love having this branding iron from Gearhart Industries. It takes a little while to warm up, but once it does, you can move through a lot of logos. Then all that's left is the final little bits. Sanding everything again, water popping it so that the grain doesn't raise, sanding it again, and then applying finish if you want to. I like the way it looks with the beeswax mineral oil mixture that I use on cutting boards, but technically speaking, you don't really need finish on these soap dishes. I have several in my house that I haven't put finish on in years, and they still work just fine. Cedar's a naturally water-resistant wood, which is why it's used so often outside and in applications like this. A soap dish by itself is a decent gift, but a great gift is if you go out and find your local soap maker and buy a couple bars of soap from them to give with your soap dish. If we can't support other local makers, then how can we ever expect people to support us? Good luck finishing up the last of your holiday gift making.